On February 25, 2005, police pulled into a quiet Wichita street and arrested the president of his own church council. Neighbors called him reliable. Records called him a Cub Scout leader, a husband, a father of two. None of that matched what investigators found waiting behind his name. 10 men are sitting in American prisons right now wearing the exact same disguise, and this video is where that disguise finally comes off. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He grew up in Wichita, joined the Air Force, came home, and settled into life as an electrician before later working in home security and as a local compliance officer. He married a woman named Paula in 1971, and they had 2 children together. On the outside, Rader looked like any other husband and father in Wichita. He led his church council, helped run the local Cub Scout troop, and was known by neighbors as quiet and dependable. Underneath that life, Rader was responsible for at least 10 deaths between January 1974 and January 1991 in and around Wichita, Kansas. He called himself BTK, short for Bind, Torture, Kill, a phrase he made up himself to describe the way he carried out his crimes. He belongs on this list because he is alive today and still serving his sentence inside a Kansas prison, decades after his last known crime. What sets his case apart is the long stretch of silence in the middle of it. He went quiet for 13 years before reaching out to the media again, and that decision is ultimately what led investigators straight to him. Before any of that happened, Rader was just another face in a quiet Kansas town, a working man with a family and a seat on his church council. Almost nobody around him saw any of this coming, and that gap between how he appeared and what he was actually doing is where his story has to begin. Rader had what looked like an ordinary childhood, the oldest of 4 brothers in a working-class household. His father worked for a local gas and electric company, and his mother kept the books for a local business. Rader later admitted that even as a boy he had violent urges he kept to himself, including harming small animals, along with disturbing thoughts he could not explain to anyone. None of this was visible to the people around him. He did fine in school, served in the Air Force, and came home to Wichita to start a normal working life as an electrician. He met Paula Dietz at church, and the 2 married in 1971. 3 years later, in early 1974, Rader was laid off from his job. Within weeks, he carried out his first attack. On January 15, 1974, Rader broke into the home of Joseph and Julie Otero, a couple in their 30s, and ended their lives along with 2 of their 5 children, 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. He took a watch and a small radio from the house as souvenirs before he left. The Otero case sat unsolved for months, with police having little to work with and a community unaware that anything connected was still to come. That silence did not last. Several months later, Rader struck again, and this time he made sure the public would know exactly who was behind it. In April 1974, Rader attacked Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old college student, inside her apartment. Her brother Kevin, who was 18 at the time, was shot but survived the attack and was able to describe what had happened, though police did not connect the case to the Otero killings right away. Months after that, in October 1974, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper. Inside, hidden in a library book the letter pointed to, was a confession to the Otero case, along with a chilling promise that there would be more. That letter is where the name BTK first appeared, written by Rader himself, as a kind of signature for what he had done and what he planned to keep doing. After that letter, the city went quiet again for a few years, but the calm did not hold. In March 1977, Rader broke into the home of 26-year-old Shirley Vian. Later that same year, in December, he targeted 25-year-old Nancy Fox. After leaving her home, Rader actually called the police from a payphone to report what he had done, and that call was recorded, giving investigators the only known recording of his voice from that era. In February 1978, he sent a letter to a local television station claiming responsibility for the Vian and Fox cases, along with another that had not yet been connected to him. In that same letter, Rader floated several different nicknames for himself, including the Wichita Strangler and the Wichita Hangman, before settling on the name that would eventually stick. That letter forced the police to publicly confirm that a serial offender was active in Wichita, and panic spread through the city. Then, in 1979, after attempting one more break-in that did not go as planned, Rader simply stopped. No new letters, no new victims, nothing. The case went cold, and many investigators began to assume he had died, been locked up for something else, or simply lost the urge. During the quiet years that followed, Rader did not disappear from the community at all. He continued attending Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, eventually working his way up to become president of the Congregation Council, a position that placed him at the center of weekly church life for years, while the city around him quietly tried to move on from a case that felt unsolvable. He went on to study criminal justice at Wichita State University, graduating in 1979, and later took a job with the city of Park City as a compliance officer, a role that gave him authority to enter homes and issue citations for things like overgrown lawns and code violations. Investigators would later note the unsettling irony of a man who had once terrorized an entire community by entering homes uninvited, now doing so legally, as part of his official daytime job. Behind the scenes, Rader was also continuing to feed his own private fantasies in ways that had nothing to do with new attacks. During what he later described to investigators as his cooling-off periods between crimes, he would dress in restraints and disguises inside his own home, photographing himself in costume while imagining scenarios tied to his earlier crimes. He also admitted to committing a long string of burglaries during these years, often stealing small items like underwear, jewelry, or cash from homes he had been watching, behavior that seemed to satisfy some of the same urges that had once driven his more violent attacks without escalating back into anything lethal during that particular stretch. That assumption that he had simply stopped turned out to be only half right. Rader had not stopped completely. He carried out 2 more known attacks during this quiet stretch that would not be connected to him until years later. In April 1985, 53-year-old Maureen Hedge died at his hands, and in September 1986, 28-year-old Vicki Wegerly was attacked inside her own home, while her 2-year-old son was present elsewhere in the house and was not harmed. In January 1991, 62-year-old Dolores Davis became his 10th and final known victim. After that, Rader genuinely did go quiet, this time for good. For 13 years, the city of Wichita lived with an unsolved case that many assumed would never be solved, while Rader continued his life as a church-going family man with a steady job, never once raising suspicion among the people who knew him. Throughout the long silence of the 1980s and into the 1990s, the investigation never fully closed, even though it produced very little forward progress. At one point, a former FBI agent named Robert Ressler, speaking at a lecture at Wichita State University, correctly guessed during a public discussion that the killer was likely a graduate student studying criminal justice, a detail that lined up almost perfectly with Rader's own background, though nobody in the room had any way of knowing that at the time. In 1998, with leads running dry, investigators turned to a newer technique known as geographic profiling, hoping to narrow down a likely area of residence for the unidentified attacker based on the locations of his earlier crimes. Even with these additional tools, the case remained unsolved for years longer, and many of the original detectives who had worked the earliest cases eventually retired without ever learning who BTK truly was. What finally ended that long silence was Rader's own decision to reach back out. In early 2004, a local newspaper ran a story marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero case, describing it as still unsolved. According to Rader's own later account, reading that story left him bored, and bored turned out to be dangerous. In March 2004, a new letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle, this time including a photocopy of Vicki Wegerly's stolen driver's license and crime scene photos that proved he was responsible for her case, something investigators had not previously confirmed. Over the following months, more letters and packages turned up around the city, often left in public places like parks and parking lots. some containing items connected to earlier cases. Rader developed an unusual habit during this period of using cereal boxes to package some of these communications, leaving them in parking lots and other public spots around Wichita, a detail that some investigators later joked may have been his own private nod to the term serial killer. One such package, left at a Home Depot parking lot in January 2005, contained jewelry connected to one of his earlier victims, and store surveillance footage captured a vehicle near the scene that could not be clearly identified at the time. Police, working with the FBI, encouraged the communication to continue, hoping it would eventually create the mistake they needed. As part of their effort to draw him out, investigators also pursued a far more direct approach, collecting DNA samples from hundreds of men throughout the Wichita area in hopes of finding a match to genetic material recovered from the original crime scenes. This effort included testing samples from ordinary residents, police officers, and even college professors, casting an extremely wide net across the community in an attempt to finally identify the person responsible. That mistake came in February 2005. Rader sent a letter asking whether police could trace a floppy disk if he sent them one, and through a coded newspaper message, they assured him it would be safe. He sent the disk anyway. Investigators traced it back to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church, the same church where Rader served as president of the Congregation Council. That single piece of digital information was enough to point detectives directly at him. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. DNA evidence later confirmed what the floppy disk had already suggested, tying him conclusively to the original crime scenes through samples collected decades earlier. Once in custody, Rader did not fight the case the way many expect a person accused of something this serious to fight. He cooperated, walked investigators through each case in detail, and later pleaded guilty rather than face a trial. In August 2005, during a sentencing hearing that stretched across 2 days, the full picture of what he had done was laid out in court, along with statements from the families who had waited decades for this moment. Because his crimes were committed before Kansas reinstated the death penalty in 1994, the maximum punishment available to the judge was life in prison. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, one for each known victim, adding up to a minimum of 175 years before any chance of release, a number that effectively guarantees he will die in custody. Rader is currently held at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he has now spent close to 2 decades behind bars. According to accounts shared by his daughter, Carrie Rawson, who published a memoir about discovering her father's true identity in 2019, Rader may have suffered a stroke around 2018 that left him with some short-term memory issues. In his own later interviews, Rader has described his daily routine behind bars as fairly settled, telling one interviewer he believes staff and other inmates treat him almost like a fixture of the facility itself, and noting that he has access to phone calls, books, and limited television privileges, including news programming and classic films. Rawson has spoken publicly on multiple occasions, including in a 2025 documentary focused on the lasting impact of her father's crimes on their family, and she has said she believes there may be more victims tied to him that were never confirmed. Investigators have periodically revisited cold cases in other states to check for any connection to him during his years of silence, though nothing beyond his 10 confirmed victims has ever been proven. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rader hid behind a job, a family, and a church council seat for over 30 years before anyone caught on. The next man on this list didn't need a hidden double life to stay free for decades. He simply walked away clean and let the case go cold on its own. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, the second of 3 sons. His family moved to Washington State while he was still a boy, and he grew up in a working-class neighborhood near Seattle. School was hard for him. He struggled with dyslexia and was held back more than once, and by most accounts, he was seen as a slow, awkward kid who did not stand out in any obvious way. As an adult, he took a job as a spray painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton, Washington. a job he would keep for most of his life. He married 3 times over the years and, by the time investigators finally caught up to him, was living a quiet life with his 3rd wife. To people who knew him at work and around the neighborhood, Ridgway came across as plain, a little dull even, and completely unremarkable. That ordinary appearance is exactly what allowed him to avoid being caught for almost 20 years while becoming the most prolific convicted serial killer in American history. Ridgway belongs on this list because he is alive today, in his 70s, and remains locked up at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. What sets his case apart from almost every other name on this list is sheer scale. He did not strike once or twice and disappear. He kept going for nearly 2 decades, moving through the Seattle area largely unnoticed, even after police had already questioned him more than once. His killing began in the summer of 1982. On July 15th of that year, 2 boys came across the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield floating in the Green River, located between the cities of Kent and Tukwila in King County, Washington. Within a month, 4 more bodies turned up nearby. The bodies belonged to women named Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Cynthia Hines. Because the first several victims were found in or near the same river, local media and investigators began calling the unknown attacker the Green River Killer, a name that stuck for the next 20 years. At the time, nobody had any idea that one quiet truck painter was responsible, and nobody had any idea just how long this case would remain unsolved. Ridgway targeted women who he believed were less likely to be missed right away, mainly young women involved in sex work and teenage runaways who moved through the area around Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road known at the time for street-level sex work. He later admitted that he chose these women specifically because he assumed police and the public would not notice quickly if they vanished, and in many tragic cases he was right. Some of his victims went missing for years before anyone connected their disappearance to the growing list of Green River cases. He would lure women into his truck, take them somewhere private, and end their lives, usually through strangulation. Afterward, he disposed of the bodies in wooded or rural areas scattered across King County, sometimes returning to the same general locations more than once, which is part of how investigators eventually built a pattern. What makes Ridgway's case especially frustrating to look back on is how many times he actually came close to being caught, only to slip through. As early as 1983, police questioned him after a witness reported seeing a woman get into his truck shortly before she disappeared. He denied any involvement. In 1984, he agreed to take a polygraph test and passed it, which helped take pressure off him as a suspect for years afterward. In 1987, investigators obtained a search warrant for his home and his truck, looking for anything that might tie him to the case, and they also collected a hair and saliva sample from him for early DNA testing. At the time, the science behind that kind of testing was still developing, and the lab could not produce a usable match. Ridgway walked away from that search free and uncharged, and he kept working at the same truck factory and living the same quiet life, while the investigation around him slowly went cold. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the case remained open but largely stalled. Detectives had built a long list of suspects over the years, and Ridgway's name sat somewhere on that list, but without stronger evidence, there was nothing prosecutors could act on. Meanwhile, more remains kept turning up across King County, each one adding to a growing total that made it clear whoever was responsible had not stopped. Some bodies were identified fairly quickly. Others would not be identified for years, sometimes decades, after they were first found. The break that finally cracked the case open had nothing to do with new information about Ridgway himself. It came from advances in forensic science. By 2001, DNA testing technology had improved dramatically compared to what was available back in 1987. Detectives went back through old evidence, including the saliva sample Ridgway had given police 14 years earlier, and ran it again using updated methods. This time, it matched genetic material recovered from several of the victims. On November 30, 2001, police arrived at the Kenworth factory in Renton and arrested Ridgway as he was leaving work. He was initially charged with the murders of 4 women: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. 3 more charges were added the following year after forensic experts matched tiny paint particles found on some remains to a specific type of spray paint used at the Kenworth plant where Ridgway worked, tying him even more directly to the crimes. As the case against him grew stronger and the possibility of a death sentence became very real, Ridgway's defense team began working toward a deal with prosecutors. In June 2003, an agreement was reached. In exchange for avoiding execution, Ridgway agreed to plead guilty to every murder he had committed in King County and to fully cooperate with investigators, helping them locate the remains of women who were still missing and confirming details about cases that had never been solved. King County prosecutor Norm Milleng later explained the reasoning behind the deal, saying that pursuing only the original charges might have led to a conviction on a handful of counts, but it would have left dozens of families without any answers about what happened to their daughters, sisters, or mothers. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a King County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. During his confession, which was read aloud in court, Ridgway described in a flat, almost business-like tone how he carried out the killings, admitting at one point that he had taken so many lives that he had trouble keeping the victims straight in his memory. He explained that he picked women involved in sex work, specifically because he believed he could continue without getting caught, since he assumed many of them would not be reported missing right away. He also admitted to transporting 2 of his victims out toward Portland, Oregon, and dumping their remains there on purpose, hoping it would throw investigators off and make the case look less connected. On December 18, 2003, Ridgway was formally sentenced for the 48 murders he had pleaded guilty to. The judge handed down 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each confirmed victim. As part of his plea deal, Ridgway had also agreed that he would plead guilty to any additional King County murders that could later be tied to him through reliable evidence, which left the door open for more charges down the road. That clause turned out to matter. In December 2010, hikers walking near a highway in Auburn, Washington found a skull close to where another victim's remains had previously been recovered. The skull was identified as belonging to 20-year-old Rebecca Marrero, a woman who had gone missing back in December 1982, and whose case Ridgway had actually confessed to years earlier, though prosecutors had not been able to formally charge him without physical proof. With Marrero's remains finally found, Ridgway pleaded guilty to her murder as well on February 18, 2011, and received a 49th consecutive life sentence. Ridgway has remained incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla since his original sentencing. Over the years, he has continued to speak with investigators and journalists from time to time, and his story has taken some strange turns even from behind bars. In 2013, he told a local Seattle reporter in a series of phone interviews that his actual number of victims was closer to 75 or 80 women, far higher than the 49 he was convicted of. Investigators have always treated these later claims with caution, since Ridgway has a documented history of being inconsistent and sometimes deceptive when describing his own crimes, and there is no way to independently confirm numbers that high. What is not in dispute, because it has already been proven in court, is that Ridgway is responsible for 49 confirmed deaths, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in United States history by an official count. Even now, decades after his arrest, the investigation around Ridgway has never fully closed. New remains tied to his case have continued to surface in the years since his sentencing. In 2023, for example, remains that had been recovered all the way back in 1985, known for years only by a case file number, were finally identified through DNA testing as belonging to 15-year-old Lori Ann Razpotnik, a girl who had been reported missing out of Lewis County, Washington, back in 1982. Each new identification offers a small piece of closure to a family that has waited decades for answers, even though Ridgway himself will never leave prison and will never face any punishment beyond the 49 life sentences he is already serving. Ridgway's case remains a brutal example of how long an ordinary-looking, soft-spoken man can operate undetected if he targets victims that society is slower to look for. He was investigated, questioned, and even searched multiple times over nearly 2 decades, and he still managed to walk free until forensic technology finally advanced enough to catch up with him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Ridgway slipped past police more than once, simply because nobody expected the quiet truck painter from Renton to be capable of what he was doing. The next man on this list did not need decades of bad luck or missed evidence to avoid suspicion. He spent years hiding in plain sight as a police officer himself, the very kind of person people were trained to trust without question. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York. He spent part of his childhood moving around with his family before they eventually settled near Sacramento, California. As a young man, he joined the United States Navy and served during the Vietnam War, then came home and studied criminal justice in college. From 1973 to 1979, DeAngelo worked as a police officer in two small Northern California towns, first in Exeter and then in Auburn. He married, had 3 daughters, and later spent 27 years working as a mechanic at a supermarket distribution center before retiring in 2017. To his neighbors, he came across as an ordinary, if somewhat short-tempered retired worker who liked to garden and tend to his lawn. What none of them knew was that DeAngelo was responsible for one of the longest and most damaging crime sprees in California history, a stretch of violence that police spent more than 4 decades trying to connect to a single person. DeAngelo belongs on this list because he is alive today, in his 80s, and is currently serving his sentence in a California state prison. What separates his case from almost every other name connected to this kind of crime is the sheer length of time between his last known offense and his eventual capture. He went undetected for over 30 years, hiding behind a badge for part of that time, and behind a completely normal retired life for the rest of it. DeAngelo's crimes began while he was still working as a police officer. In the mid-1970s, a wave of break-ins struck the city of Visalia, California, an area close to where he was stationed as an officer in nearby Exeter. The person responsible for these break-ins became known locally as the Visalia Ransacker, a name based on the strange way he would search through homes, taking small items and sometimes rearranging belongings without explanation. On September 11, 1975, that pattern turned deadly. A college professor named Claude Snelling was shot and killed in front of his daughter at the family home, and the attacker kicked the young woman several times before fleeing into the night. For decades, the connection between this killing and the man responsible would remain unknown. After leaving the Exeter police force and moving to a position with the Auburn Police Department, DeAngelo's crimes shifted location and changed in nature. Starting around 1976, a string of break-ins and assaults began across the Sacramento area. The man responsible became known as the East Area Rapist, a name tied to where most of the early attacks took place. Investigators say he would often watch a home for days before breaking in, frequently targeting people who lived alone before later shifting to couples. He would tie up his victims, sometimes spending hours inside the home before leaving. Over roughly 3 years, more than 36 separate attacks across the Sacramento and Stockton areas were tied to the same person, even though nobody yet knew who that person actually was. On February 2, 1978, the violence in the Sacramento area turned fatal again. A married couple, Brian and Katie Maggiore, were walking their dog one evening in their Rancho Cordova neighborhood when they were chased down. Brian was shot first, and when Katie ran and screamed for help, she was caught and killed as well. For years, investigators were not certain this attack was connected to the East Area Rapist cases, since the method was different from the earlier break-ins. It would take decades and major advances in forensic science before police could confirm that this couple's deaths were part of the same pattern. By late 1978, the attacks had expanded into the Bay Area, with reported incidents in cities including Concord, San Jose, Danville, Fremont, and Walnut Creek. The final reported Bay Area attack happened in the summer of 1979. After that, the man behind these crimes seemed to vanish from Northern California completely. In reality, he had simply moved south, and his crimes were about to escalate even further. Starting in October 1979, a series of attacks began appearing in Goleta, a community near Santa Barbara, California. In an early attempt there, the intruder had to flee after a neighbor heard sounds of a struggle. He did not stop. On December 30th, 1979, a couple named Deborah Manning and Robert Offerman were found dead inside a home in Goleta. In March 1980, a couple named Lyman and Charlene Smith were killed inside their home in Ventura, discovered later by Lyman's 12-year-old son. More attacks and deaths followed across Southern California over the next several years, hitting communities including Irvine and Dana Point, with investigators eventually connecting at least 10 deaths in this southern stretch of the crime spree to the same unknown attacker. Because of how he operated under cover of darkness, this version of the offender became known to Santa Barbara investigators as the Night Stalker, a name later changed to the original Night Stalker once that nickname became associated with a different, unrelated criminal active around the same time. For years, police in different counties had no idea they were investigating the very same man. The cases were scattered across more than a dozen separate jurisdictions in Northern and Southern California, each working its own files with no shared system connecting them. It would take the arrival of modern DNA testing decades later for investigators to finally prove that the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker were not three separate criminals at all, but a single man operating across the entire state of California for more than 10 years. DNA testing eventually confirmed in the early 2000s that these cases were connected, and the combined series of crimes was given a new name by a true crime writer named Michelle McNamara, who called him the Golden State Killer in her research and writing. McNamara spent years trying to identify the man behind these crimes and helped push renewed public attention back onto the case, though she passed away in 2016, 2 years before an arrest was ever made. The break that finally identified D'Angelo came through a forensic technique that had never before been used to solve a major American criminal case. Investigators took DNA collected from old crime scenes and uploaded a profile built from that evidence to a public genealogy website, the same kind of service ordinary people use to research their family history. The website returned a match to a distant relative of D'Angelo, which allowed investigators to narrow their search down through his family tree until his name came up as a strong possibility based on his age and where he had lived during the years the attacks occurred. To confirm the match without alerting him, detectives secretly collected a DNA sample from the door handle of his car and later from a tissue he had thrown away in his curbside trash. Both samples matched the DNA tied to the crimes. On April 24, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. He was 72 years old at the time. After his arrest, while sitting alone in an interview room and apparently unaware he was being recorded, D'Angelo was heard saying to himself that he had done all of those things and that he had destroyed all those lives. Over the following months, prosecutors from 6 different California counties worked together, eventually charging him with 13 counts of first-degree murder, along with related kidnapping charges. Because California's statute of limitations had already expired on the sexual assault cases from decades earlier, D'Angelo could not be formally charged for those crimes, even though investigators were confident he was responsible for dozens of them across multiple counties. For a period after his arrest, prosecutors stated publicly that they intended to pursue the death penalty, calling D'Angelo's case the clearest possible example of when capital punishment should apply. Given his advanced age and the decades that had passed since the crimes occurred, along with the complexity of trying a case spread across 6 counties, prosecutors eventually agreed to a plea deal instead. On June 29, 2020, D'Angelo appeared in a Sacramento County courtroom, set up inside a university ballroom large enough to allow proper distance between attendees because of health concerns at the time, that pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 related charges. As part of the agreement, he also formally admitted, on the record, to additional assaults from decades earlier that could no longer be prosecuted, giving many of those earlier victims a form of acknowledgement they had waited a lifetime to hear, even without a formal conviction attached. In the weeks following his guilty plea, the court held several days of hearings allowing victims and family members to speak directly to D'Angelo before sentencing. Survivors described decades of fear that followed them long after their attacks, describing how ordinary sounds or sights could still trigger panic even 40 years later. Family members of those who had been killed spoke about losing parents, siblings, and children, and about spending decades not knowing who was responsible or whether they would ever see an arrest in their lifetime. D'Angelo, who appeared in court in a wheelchair for much of the proceedings, eventually stood on his own during his final appearance and told the court that he was truly sorry to everyone he had hurt. On August 21, 2020, D'Angelo was formally sentenced. The judge handed down the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement, consisting of 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with an additional life sentence carrying extra years attached. The judge stated plainly that D'Angelo would spend the rest of his life behind the walls of a state prison, and made clear that the decision to avoid the death penalty was based on practical factors tied to his age and the age of the case, not on any belief that his crimes did not deserve the harshest possible punishment. D'Angelo remains incarcerated in the California state prison system, where he is expected to spend the rest of his life. His case fundamentally changed how police across the country approach unsolved crimes, since his capture proved for the first time that public genealogy websites, originally built to help ordinary people trace their family history, could be used to identify violent offenders whose DNA had sat unmatched in police evidence rooms for decades. Since his arrest, well over 100 other suspects in unrelated cold cases have been identified across the country using the very same genetic genealogy technique that finally caught him. What makes D'Angelo's case so unsettling to so many people is not just the staggering number of crimes connected to him across more than a decade, but the fact that for part of that time, he was the very person communities trusted to protect them. He wore a police uniform while some of his earliest crimes were already underway, and he spent the following decades hiding behind the kind of quiet, unremarkable retirement that nobody would think twice about. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. D'Angelo wore a badge while some of his earliest crimes were happening, the very symbol of safety hiding the exact opposite underneath it. The next man on this list never needed a uniform to disappear. He simply blended into one of the most ordinary corners of New York City, until a routine traffic stop for a missing license plate ended everything. Joel Rifkin, the Long Island serial killer. Joel David Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959, in New York. His birth parents were both young college students who were unable to raise him, and 3 weeks after he was born, he was adopted by a couple named Bernard and Jean Rifkin, who lived on Long Island and later adopted a daughter as well. On the surface, Rifkin grew up in a comfortable middle-class household with two loving parents who gave him every advantage they could. Underneath that surface, his childhood was much harder than it looked. He struggled in school due to undiagnosed learning disabilities, including dyslexia and a stutter, and he became a frequent target of bullying from classmates who picked up on how different and withdrawn he seemed. Former classmates have described him being physically pushed around and excluded from almost every social activity throughout his school years. That isolation, combined with his learning struggles, left Rifkin deeply alienated by the time he reached adulthood, and according to later psychiatric evaluations, it also fed disturbing private fantasies that he never shared with anyone close to him. Rifkin belongs on this list because he is alive today, in his 60s, and remains locked up inside a maximum security prison in upstate New York. What makes his story stand out is just how long he managed to operate without anyone connecting the dots, killing women across Long Island and New York City over a span of roughly 4 years, while living quietly with his adoptive mother the entire time. In February 1987, Rifkin's adoptive father, Bernard, took his own life after struggling for months with a serious illness. Rifkin later told investigators and psychiatrists that this loss hit him extremely hard and marked a turning point in his life, deepening feelings of anger and hopelessness that had been building inside him for years. Just months after his father's death, in August 1987, Rifkin was arrested during a sting operation after offering an undercover female officer money for sex in Hempstead, New York. That arrest did not lead to any serious consequences at the time, and Rifkin returned to his quiet life as an unemployed young man still living at his mother's home in East Meadow. What nobody around him realized was that this brush with police involving a sex worker was a preview of a much darker pattern that was about to begin. Rifkin's first known attack happened on February 20th, 1989. He brought a woman he knew only by a nickname back to his childhood home while his mother was away. By the end of that encounter, the woman was dead, and Rifkin spent the following days trying to dispose of her remains in a way that would prevent anyone from identifying her. Parts of her remains were later discovered scattered across separate locations in New Jersey and around the New York City waterways, but without modern forensic tools, investigators at the time had no way to determine who she was or who was responsible. It would take more than 20 years and major advances in DNA identification before this victim was finally confirmed to be a woman named Heidi Balch, whose case had originally gone completely unsolved because she had used several different names and identification numbers over the course of her life, making her difficult to trace even after her family eventually reported her missing. After this first attack, Rifkin did not strike again for roughly a year and a half, a gap that later led investigators and psychiatrists to study his pattern closely once his full confession came out. His second known victim was a woman named Julie Blackbird, who Rifkin brought back to his Long Island home again while his mother was traveling. As with his first victim, Rifkin went to extreme lengths afterward to prevent anyone from being able to identify or locate her remains, disposing of them across the East River and a nearby waterway in Brooklyn. For a long stretch of time, neither case raised any public alarm, since both women had been involved in sex work and lived somewhat transient lives, meaning their absences were not immediately reported or connected to anything unusual happening in the area. Throughout the early 1990s, Rifkin continued targeting women involved in sex work, almost always picking them up either in Manhattan or along certain Long Island roads known at the time for street-level activity of this kind. He developed something close to a routine. He would wait until his mother was away from the house, bring a woman back to the property, and then carry out the attack before spending hours afterward trying to make sure nothing connected back to him. In 1991, Rifkin started his own small landscaping business, and investigators later learned that he used a rented job site connected to that business as a place to temporarily store remains before eventually disposing of them elsewhere. Among the women police later confirmed as his victims from this period were Barbara Jacobs, Mary Ellen DeLuca, and a woman named Yun Lee, along with several others whose names became known only after Rifkin's eventual confession years later. What allowed Rifkin to continue for so long without drawing attention was largely tied to who he was targeting. Many of his victims were sex workers or women struggling with addiction, groups that police departments at the time often treated with less urgency when reports of a missing person came in. Several of the women he targeted had no close family checking in regularly, and some used multiple names over the course of their lives, which made it even harder for investigators to connect any of the disappearances to one another, let alone to a single living person quietly working a landscaping job on Long Island. By June 1993, Rifkin had killed at least 16 women without ever being formally suspected of anything more serious than the solicitation arrest from years earlier. On June 24, 1993, he picked up a 22-year-old woman named Tiffany Bresciani on a street in Manhattan. Bresciani had told her boyfriend, a musician named Dave Rubenstein, that she would be back within about 20 minutes. When she failed to return, Rubenstein called the police and gave them a description of the pickup truck he had seen her get into. Bresciani became Rifkin's final victim. Afterward, Rifkin transported her body back toward his home, where it remained hidden on the property for several days while he tried to figure out how to dispose of it without drawing attention. On the early morning of June 28, 1993, at around 3:15 a.m., New York State troopers patrolling the Southern State Parkway noticed Rifkin's pickup truck was missing a rear license plate. When they attempted to pull him over, Rifkin did not stop. Instead, he led police on a chase, that reached speeds up to 90 miles per hour and stretched across several roads in Nassau County for roughly 20 to 25 minutes, with additional local police units joining as the pursuit continued. The chase ended when Rifkin attempted to make a turn and lost control of the truck, crashing into a light pole along the road. When troopers approached the wrecked vehicle and searched it, they found the body of Tiffany Bresciani in the bed of the truck. Rifkin was taken into custody immediately. At first, he gave police a confused and inconsistent account of how the body ended up in his truck, but within hours, he began confessing in detail, not just to Bresciani's death, but to a long history of similar attacks stretching back years. Over the following day, Rifkin described all of the women he believed he had killed, providing names where he remembered them and sketching out maps to help investigators locate remains that had never been found. In total, he claimed responsibility for 17 separate cases. A specialized task force was formed to investigate every name and location Rifkin provided, and over time, investigators were able to locate and identify the remains of most of the women he described, though a small number of his claimed victims were never conclusively confirmed due to the passage of time and the condition of the remains. When detectives searched the home where Rifkin had lived with his mother, they found a disturbing collection of items connected to several of his victims, including personal identification cards, jewelry, and other small belongings that appeared to have been kept as souvenirs. This evidence, combined with Rifkin's own detailed confessions, gave prosecutors an unusually strong case heading into trial, even though they still had to prove each individual murder in court. Rifkin was first formally charged in connection with the killing of Tiffany Bresciani, since that case carried the clearest physical evidence tied directly to his arrest. His trial in Nassau County began in the spring of 1994. During the proceedings, Rifkin took the stand in his own defense and openly admitted to the killing, but his legal team argued that he should be found not criminally responsible due to mental illness, pointing to his lifelong learning struggles, his history of social isolation, and the emotional impact of his father's death years earlier. A psychiatrist for the prosecution, Dr. Park Dietz, testified that while Rifkin clearly suffered from significant mental health issues, he understood what he was doing and was capable of controlling his actions, meaning he did not meet the legal standard required for an insanity defense. The defense brought forward its own experts who argued the opposite, claiming Rifkin suffered from a serious psychotic condition that left him unable to resist his violent urges. On May 9, 1994, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Rifkin guilty of second-degree murder in Bresciani's death, along with a related charge of reckless endangerment tied to the high-speed chase that ended in his arrest. He was sentenced that same year to 25 years to life in prison for the murder charge. This was only the beginning of his legal proceedings, since prosecutors in multiple other counties still needed to bring their own cases forward based on the additional victims Rifkin had already confessed to. Over the following 2 years, Rifkin appeared in court repeatedly as additional charges moved forward in different jurisdictions, ultimately pleading guilty to 8 more counts of second-degree murder rather than face separate trials for each one. By September 1995, he had received 2 more life sentences tied to specific victims he had confessed to, and by the end of that year, he had picked up 3 additional sentences after pleading guilty to more cases from his original confession. In January 1996, 2 more life sentences were added, bringing his total number of convictions to 9 separate counts of second-degree murder across multiple New York counties, along with the original reckless endangerment charge connected to the chase. When all of these sentences were combined and ordered to run one after another rather than at the same time, Rifkin's total sentence came out to 203 years, a number that effectively guarantees he will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, regardless of any future parole hearing dates listed on paper. Rifkin's time in prison has not been ordinary, even by the standards of someone serving a sentence this long. Shortly after his conviction, he was held at Attica Correctional Facility, one of New York's most well-known maximum security prisons. In 1996, corrections officials determined that having Rifkin in the general population posed too much risk, both to other inmates and to Rifkin himself, given how widely known his case had become. As a result, He was placed in a restricted housing unit, confined to his cell for 23 hours out of each day, for more than 4 years. Rifkin eventually filed a legal challenge arguing that this extended isolation violated his constitutional rights, but in 2000, a state appellate court ruled against him, finding that prison officials had acted appropriately given the unique security concerns surrounding his case. Not long after that ruling, Rifkin was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Clinton County, New York, where he remains incarcerated today alongside roughly 200 other inmates who, like him, are kept separate from the facility's general population due to safety concerns. In the years since his conviction, Rifkin has occasionally spoken publicly about his crimes through interviews conducted from prison, offering a small but unsettling window into how he has reflected on what he did. In one interview years after his sentencing, he admitted that if he had not been caught during that traffic stop in 1993, he likely would have continued killing, acknowledging that despite occasionally wanting to stop, he probably would not have been able to on his own. Investigators who worked his case have described him in similarly chilling terms, with the lead prosecutor at his original trial calling him a deliberate and methodical offender who carried out his crimes with disturbing precision rather than acting out of sudden, uncontrollable rage. What makes Rifkin's case especially difficult to look back on is how completely invisible his crimes were to the people around him while they were happening. He lived under the same roof as his adoptive mother for the entire span of his killing, coming and going from a quiet suburban home in East Meadow as though nothing unusual was taking place. He ran a small, legitimate landscaping business that gave him a built-in excuse for unusual hours and access to outdoor work sites. None of his neighbors, none of his former classmates, and seemingly none of his own family ever suspected that the quiet, awkward man living among them was responsible for the deaths of more than a dozen women across two of the busiest, most heavily populated counties in the entire country. Today, decades later, Rifkin remains in custody, still serving out a sentence that will never end before his natural life does. Some of his victims were identified only years after his original confession, as forensic technology slowly caught up to cases that had once seemed impossible to solve. His case remains one of the clearest examples in American history of how easily a serial offender can hide for years simply by choosing victims that society, and at times even law enforcement, was slower to look for or report missing in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rifkin lived under his own mother's roof the entire time he was killing, hiding in the most unremarkable corner of suburban Long Island anyone could imagine. The next case on this list takes us away from a quiet residential street and into the middle of a major American city already gripped by fear, where the man eventually arrested was never even charged with most of the deaths he was suspected of causing. Wayne Williams, the Atlanta child murders suspect. Wayne Bertram Williams was born on May 27, 1958, in Atlanta, Georgia, the son of Homer and Faye Williams, who both worked as school teachers. Growing up in the Dixie Hills neighborhood on the southwest side of the city, Williams developed an early interest in radio and media. As a teenager and young adult, he built his own small radio transmitter and spent a lot of time hanging around two local stations, eventually working to become a music promoter and freelance photographer in his early 20s. To people who knew him casually, Williams came across as ambitious, talkative, and image-conscious, someone who liked to be seen as a rising young professional in Atlanta's media and music scene. He was 23 years old when his name became permanently tied to one of the most disturbing and controversial cases in American criminal history. Williams belongs on this list because he is alive today, in his 60s, and remains incarcerated in a Georgia state prison. What makes his case unlike almost anything else covered here is that he was only ever formally tried and convicted for 2 deaths, even though investigators came to believe he was connected to more than 20 others, and even though significant public doubt about his guilt has followed him for more than 4 decades. The events that became known as the Atlanta child murders began in the summer of 1979. On July 21 of that year, 14-year-old Edward Hope Smith disappeared. Just days later, on July 25th, 13-year-old Alfred Evans also went missing. Both boys were soon found dead, and their deaths marked the start of a wave of disappearances that would grip the city of Atlanta for the next 2 years. Over the following months, more young black residents of Atlanta, mostly children and teenagers, but eventually some young adults as well, began disappearing and turning up dead in wooded areas, along roadsides, and in nearby rivers. Authorities eventually connected at least 28, and by some official counts as many as 30, separate cases to what came to be treated as a single ongoing investigation, even though it was never fully clear whether one person or multiple people were responsible for every case included on that list. As the number of missing and deceased children climbed throughout 1979 and into 1980, fear spread across Atlanta's black community in a way that touched nearly every household with children. Parents stopped letting kids walk to school alone. Curfews tightened across entire neighborhoods. Local task forces formed specifically to investigate the growing list of cases, and by mid-1980, the situation had drawn national attention, with reporters from across the country covering the city's growing panic. The FBI became formally involved in June 1980, after the abduction of a 7-year-old girl raised the possibility that federal kidnapping laws had been violated, giving federal investigators a clear legal basis to join what had, until that point, been handled primarily by local Atlanta police and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Throughout 1980 and into early 1981, investigators struggled to find consistent physical evidence connecting any single suspect to the growing number of cases. Many of the victims had been found in wooded or rural areas outside the city, and a number of them showed signs of asphyxiation rather than any other obvious cause of death, which suggested at least some pattern connecting several of the cases together. Even with that pattern, building an actual case against any one person proved difficult, since so many of the bodies had been outdoors for extended periods before being discovered, which limited how much physical evidence remained usable by the time forensic examiners got involved. The investigation's turning point came in May 1981. Acting on a tip, a team of investigators began conducting surveillance along the Jackson Parkway Bridge over the Chattahoochee River, an area where several earlier victims had eventually been recovered. In the early morning hours of May 22, 1981, officers stationed near the bridge heard a loud splash in the water below and saw ripples forming on the surface shortly afterward. Almost immediately, a car was seen leaving the bridge. Police stopped the vehicle nearby and identified the driver as Wayne Williams. At the time, officers had no body and no direct evidence connecting Williams to anything illegal, so he was questioned and then released. 2 days later, on May 24th, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater was pulled from the river, not far from where the splash had been heard. In the days that followed, investigators began building a circumstantial case against Williams. Witnesses came forward describing having seen Williams in the company of Cater on the night he was believed to have died, with one man telling police he had seen the two of them together near a local theater entrance. Around the same time, co-workers told investigators that they had noticed scratches on Williams's face and arms in the period surrounding several of the disappearances, scratches that investigators theorized could have come from a physical struggle. Williams responded publicly by holding a press conference outside his own home, insisting on his innocence and stating that he had voluntarily taken several polygraph tests, all of which had come back inconclusive, though he acknowledged that none of those results would have been usable in an actual courtroom anyway. He was brought in and questioned extensively by FBI agents over a 2-day period in early June 1981, but was released without being charged at that time, even as investigators kept him under close surveillance. On June 21, 1981, Williams was formally arrested. A grand jury indicted him on charges connected to the deaths of 2 adult men, Nathaniel Cater, age 27, and Jimmy Ray Payne, age 21. Both of whom had been recovered from the same general area along the river. Williams's trial began on January 6, 1982, in Fulton County, and it quickly became one of the most closely watched court cases in the country, drawing reporters from across the nation to cover daily proceedings. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on forensic fiber and hair evidence rather than direct physical proof or a confession. Specialists testified that an unusual type of greenish-yellow carpet fiber, along with a distinctive violet-colored fiber, had been recovered from several of the victims' bodies. Investigators traced the carpet fiber back to a specific, relatively uncommon type manufactured by a textile company, and through detailed sales data, calculated that only a small fraction of homes in the entire Atlanta area would have contained that particular carpet. That fiber was found in Williams's own bedroom. Additional hair and fiber samples recovered from multiple victims were also matched to material from Williams's car and from his family's pet dog, a German Shepherd. Prosecutors argued that the combined weight of so many separate fiber matches across multiple victims made it extremely unlikely that anyone other than Williams could be responsible. The defense pushed back hard against this evidence, arguing that fiber matching, while useful, was far less precise than other forms of forensic identification and could not exclude other possible sources for the material found on the victims. Williams took the stand himself, denying any involvement in the deaths and offering alternative explanations for both the splash heard near the bridge and the presence of his fibers on multiple bodies, suggesting that his active social life and frequent contact with many people in the community could account for the matches. During his testimony, Williams grew visibly frustrated under cross-examination, and prosecutors leaned heavily into that moment as a sign of deception in their closing arguments to the jury. After about 11 to 12 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on February 27, 1982, finding Williams guilty of the murders of both Cater and Payne. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. Almost immediately after the verdict, Atlanta police announced that they were closing 22 additional cases connected to the broader pattern of child and young adult deaths from the previous 2 years, publicly stating that they believed Williams was responsible for those deaths as well, even though he was never formally charged or tried for any of them. This decision effectively closed the books on one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history, without ever putting most of the alleged crimes in front of a jury. The killings connected to the broader case did stop almost entirely after Williams's arrest, a fact that prosecutors and many investigators have continued to point to over the decades as strong supporting evidence of his guilt, even in the absence of additional convictions. At the same time, doubts about the case have never fully gone away. Some of the original investigators, along with several victims' family members, have publicly stated over the years that they do not believe Williams, the son of 2 respected educators, was capable of or responsible for so many deaths. Members of Atlanta's black community at the time also raised concerns that the investigation moved too quickly to settle on a single suspect once political pressure to resolve the case became overwhelming, especially given the strained relationship between Atlanta's police department and the communities most affected by the killings. Over the years, Williams has continued to fight his conviction through the legal system. In the late 1990s, he filed a petition seeking a new trial, which was denied by a Butts County judge, with Georgia's Attorney General at the time stating publicly that the state intended to keep defending the original conviction through every stage of appeal. In 2004, Williams again sought a retrial, this time with his legal team arguing that investigators had ignored or covered up potential evidence pointing toward members of a white supremacist organization, and separately challenging whether the original fiber evidence could withstand modern scientific scrutiny. A federal judge rejected that request in October 2006, leaving the original conviction in place. Public interest in the case has never fully faded, partly fueled by ongoing questions about whether all 20-some additional deaths attributed to Williams were truly connected to him or to each other. In 2005, DeKalb County's police chief at the time, Lewis Graham, who had been one of the original investigators on the case decades earlier, made the unusual decision to formally reopen several of the unsolved cases under his jurisdiction, stating publicly that he personally doubted Williams was responsible for all of the deaths that had quietly been closed and attributed to him without trial. Graham specifically pointed to 5 cases involving young victims whose deaths he felt deserved a closer second look. More recently, in March 2019, officials in Atlanta, acting under the direction of the city's mayor at the time, ordered a broader re-examination of evidence from the original case files, hoping that modern forensic testing methods unavailable in the early 1980s might finally provide clearer answers about some of the unresolved cases. As of now, that renewed review has not resulted in any additional charges, and Fulton County authorities have not reopened the cases that fall under their jurisdiction. Williams has consistently denied responsibility for any of the deaths connected to this case, both the two he was convicted of and the many more he was never formally tried for. He has stated that Atlanta officials rushed to settle on him as a single convenient suspect in order to bring a politically explosive situation to a close, rather than fully pursuing other leads that existed at the time. His legal team has continued to describe his conviction as one of the most significant ongoing injustices in the American legal system, while prosecutors who originally tried the case have maintained their confidence in the verdict, often pointing to the simple fact that the broader wave of deaths stopped almost entirely once Williams was taken into custody and has never resumed in anything resembling the same pattern since. Williams is currently incarcerated within the Georgia State Prison System, where he has remained since his original 1982 sentencing. He has been denied parole multiple times over the years, since first becoming eligible in the mid-2000s, and at this point, with 2 consecutive life sentences already on his record, there is little realistic possibility that he will ever be released. Whatever the full truth of his involvement in Atlanta's broader wave of unsolved deaths may be, Williams remains one of the clearest examples in American history of a case where a single conviction effectively closed an investigation into dozens of deaths, leaving many families with neither a trial nor a clear, fully proven answer about what truly happened to the people they lost. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Williams was convicted of only 2 deaths, yet an entire wave of unsolved cases was quietly closed around him without ever facing a courtroom. The next case on this list moves away from a single contested suspect entirely and into one of the rare instances in American history where 2 relatives carried out a string of killings together. Kenneth Bianchi, the hillside strangler Kenneth Alessio Bianchi, was born on May 22, 1951, in Rochester, New York. His birth mother was a teenager who was unable to care for him, and within 2 weeks of his birth, he was placed for adoption. He was adopted soon after by an Italian-American couple, Nicholas and Frances Bianchi, and grew up as their only child. By most outward measures, Bianchi had a fairly normal early life. He did reasonably well in school, married young, and held a series of steady jobs, including security and retail positions. He also developed a long-running habit of lying about his qualifications, at one point even purchasing fake psychology credentials and briefly renting office space to present himself as a counselor, despite having no real training. In 1976, Bianchi moved from Rochester out to Los Angeles, California, to be closer to an older cousin on his adoptive side of the family, a man named Angelo Buono Jr. That move and that relationship would set off one of the most disturbing partnerships in American criminal history. Bianchi belongs on this list because he is alive today, in his 70s, and remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. What makes his case different from almost every other name covered so far is that he did not operate alone. Along with his cousin Buono, Bianchi was part of one of the rare instances in American history where 2 family members worked together over an extended period to carry out a string of killings, splitting responsibility for crimes that neither of them could have carried out alone in quite the same way. When Bianchi arrived in Los Angeles, Buono was already established there, running a small upholstery shop out of his home in Glendale, California, and supplementing his income by arranging for young women to work as escorts. Bianchi was drawn to his older cousin's confident, controlling personality and the lifestyle that came with it. Before long, the 2 men were working together managing a small number of young women, and by late 1977, their relationship had escalated into something far more violent. The first confirmed victim connected to the 2 men was 19-year-old Yolanda Washington, who worked part-time as a waitress. On October 17, 1977, Bianchi and Buono approached her while posing as police officers, a tactic they would use repeatedly throughout their crimes, flashing fake badges, and convincing women to get into Bianchi's car, under the impression that they were dealing with actual law enforcement. Washington's body was discovered the following day on a hillside near a freeway in Los Angeles, and investigators noted signs that she had been restrained and strangled before being left there. Because of where her body, and the bodies that soon followed, kept turning up, Los Angeles media outlets began referring to the unknown attacker as the Hillside Strangler, a name that would stick for the remainder of the case, even after investigators eventually realized they were dealing with two people rather than one. Over the following months, between October 1977 and February 1978, at least 10 more young women and girls lost their lives in a similar pattern. Victims ranged widely in age, including some who were full-grown adults, and disturbingly, 2 who were still in their early teenage years. Early victims tended to be women working in the sex trade, since Bianchi and Buono had direct access to that world already through Buono's existing arrangements. As the months went on, however, the two men expanded their pattern to include other young women from the surrounding community who had no connection to that lifestyle at all, which made the pattern far harder for investigators to immediately recognize as connected. Most of the killings took place inside Buono's upholstery shop in Glendale, after which the bodies were transported and left along various hillsides and roadways scattered across Los Angeles County, often cleaned beforehand in an apparent attempt to limit the physical evidence investigators might be able to recover. The final confirmed victim connected to the two men was 20-year-old Cindy Lee Hudspeth, a college student who also worked part-time as a waitress. Her case came about somewhat differently than the others. She had originally gone to Buono's shop simply seeking legitimate upholstery work for her car, and it was only after Bianchi arrived and the two men spoke privately that they decided to target her as their next victim. On February 17, 1978, her body was discovered inside the trunk of her own car, which had been pushed off a cliff along a highway outside the city. That discovery effectively marked the end of the active killing period connected to the two men, though it would still be almost a full year before investigators were able to connect anyone specific to the crimes. For months after Hudspeth's death, the broader Los Angeles area remained gripped by fear over the still unidentified Hillside Strangler, with task forces formed specifically to investigate the growing list of cases. Despite an intense public investigation, neither Bianchi nor Buono were initially treated as serious suspects, even though Bianchi had at one point actually applied for a position with the Los Angeles Police Department during the same general period these crimes were taking place, and had even been allowed to join officers on patrol rides while they searched for the very killer he was helping to evade detection as. After the killings in Los Angeles stopped, Bianchi relocated north to Bellingham, Washington, to be closer to a girlfriend and their young son. He found work there as a security guard and even joined a county sheriff's reserve program in a volunteer capacity. In January 1979, 2 students from Western Washington University, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder, went missing after Bianchi reportedly offered them money to do a small task for him related to his security job. Both women were soon found dead, and investigators quickly connected Bianchi to their deaths after his car was identified near the scene. He was arrested on January 12, 1979. During questioning, and later under hypnosis as part of a psychiatric evaluation, Bianchi attempted to claim that a separate personality, which he referred to as Steve Walker, was actually responsible for the Bellingham killings, hoping this claim of a split personality might support an insanity defense. Mental health professionals who examined him at length eventually concluded that Bianchi was not genuinely experiencing any kind of multiple personality condition, and was instead consciously inventing the story in an attempt to avoid full responsibility for what he had done. Once it became clear that this strategy was not going to hold up, Bianchi shifted his approach entirely. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty to the 2 Bellingham killings, confess to his role in 5 of the Los Angeles deaths, and formally testify against his cousin Angelo Buono as the other person responsible for the broader pattern of crimes back in California. Bianchi's cooperation set off Buono's arrest almost immediately. Acting on the information Bianchi provided, investigators arrested Buono at his Glendale home, which doubled as his upholstery shop, in October 1979. He was charged with a long list of serious offenses connected to the case. Because Bianchi's own credibility was central to building a case against Buono, prosecutors structured their plea agreement carefully, ensuring that Bianchi's guilty plea would hold up and that his testimony would be treated as legally valid once Buono's trial began. Buono's trial turned out to be an unusually long and difficult legal process, dragging on for roughly 2 years before reaching a verdict. Part of the difficulty stemmed from Bianchi himself. Even though he had agreed to testify against his cousin as part of his own plea deal, Bianchi's actual testimony in court was inconsistent and at times appeared to be a deliberate attempt to undermine the very case he was supposed to be helping build, leading some observers at the time to believe he was quietly trying to help his cousin avoid conviction despite his formal agreement with prosecutors. Investigators and prosecutors pushed forward regardless, relying heavily on physical evidence and additional witness accounts gathered over the course of the original investigation. In November 1983, the jury found Buono guilty in connection with 9 of the 10 Los Angeles area deaths. He was formally sentenced in January 1984 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bianchi, having already entered his plea years earlier, received a combined sentence covering both the Washington and California cases, totaling 6 life sentences with the possibility of parole built into the agreement, since avoiding execution had been the central goal of his original deal with prosecutors. He has remained incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla ever since, a facility he was sent to specifically because his plea agreement allowed him to serve his combined sentence there, rather than in California. Bianchi's time behind bars produced one of the stranger side stories connected to the entire case. In 1980, while awaiting the resolution of his legal situation, Bianchi began corresponding with a woman named Veronica Compton, who had written to him originally to ask for his thoughts on a play she had written involving a fictional female killer. The two grew close through repeated letters and visits, and Bianchi eventually convinced Compton to attempt to recreate one of his earlier crimes on her own, hoping it would create the impression that the real Hillside Strangler was still active somewhere out in the world, which he believed might help raise doubts about his own guilt. Compton traveled to Washington and attempted to lure a woman to a motel room with the intention of harming her, but the attempt failed when the intended victim managed to fight back and escape. Compton was arrested and later convicted for her role in that attempted attack, receiving her own separate prison sentence as a result. Buono spent the remainder of his life in custody following his 1984 sentencing. He died of a heart attack on September 21, 2002, while still incarcerated at Calipatria State Prison in California at the age of 67. With Buono's death, Bianchi became the only one of the 2 cousins still alive to account for the broader pattern of crimes connected to the Hillside Strangler case. Since his original sentencing, Bianchi has come up for parole consideration multiple separate times, and he has been denied at every single hearing held so far, including hearings held in 2010 and again as recently as 2025. Parole boards reviewing his case have consistently pointed to the scale and severity of the crimes connected to him, along with his documented history of deception during his own legal proceedings, as reasons to keep him behind bars despite the technical possibility of release built into his original sentence decades ago. What makes the Bianchi and Buono case especially unsettling to look back on is how completely the 2 men were able to hide behind an ordinary, even mundane cover story for months, while carrying out their crimes. Buono ran a legitimate small business out of his own home, the very same property where most of the killings took place, while Bianchi held down steady jobs and even attempted to join law enforcement himself during the exact period these crimes were occurring. Their shared family connection, something that should have represented an ordinary, unremarkable relationship between 2 relatives, instead became the foundation for one of the most damaging partnerships in the history of American serial crime. Bianchi remains in custody today, decades after his cousin's death closed one half of this case permanently. He continues to be denied release at every parole hearing, and given the consistent pattern of those denials, there is little indication that outcome will change anytime soon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bianchi and Buono are a rare example of family turning into a partnership built entirely around violence rather than trust. The next case on this list shifts away from a long-running partnership entirely, landing instead on a single South Carolina business owner whose crimes went undiscovered for over a decade until one survivor managed to escape. Todd Kohlhepp, the real estate agent killer. Todd Christopher Kohlhepp, originally born under the last name Samsel, was born on March 7, 1971, in Florida. His early life was marked by a great deal of instability. His parents divorced when he was just 2 years old, and his mother soon remarried, leaving Kohlhepp to grow up with a stepfather he reportedly never got along with, all while having very little contact with his biological father, whom he later said he had not seen in years by the time he was a teenager. From a young age, Kohlhepp showed troubling behavior. Teachers and counselors who evaluated him during his school years described him as aggressive toward other children, sometimes destroying their belongings without any clear provocation. Psychological evaluations conducted on him as a teenager noted that he had an above-average intelligence level, with one judge later commenting that Kohlhepp was sharp enough to be advanced academically, but behaviorally unpredictable and difficult to manage. That same evaluation warned that he might never be fully capable of being rehabilitated, a prediction that would prove disturbingly accurate decades later. Kohlhepp belongs on this list because he is alive today, in his 50s, and remains incarcerated inside a South Carolina state prison. What separates his case from many others covered so far is the sheer length of time between his first known violent crime and his eventual capture as an adult serial offender, along with the unusual way his final crimes were eventually uncovered, not through forensic science or a confession, but because one woman managed to survive and tell investigators what had happened to her. Kohlhepp's first serious brush with the legal system happened when he was still a teenager. In 1986, at the age of 15, he forced a 14-year-old neighbor back to his home at gunpoint, where he restrained her and assaulted her. He was eventually arrested and charged in connection with the incident. In 1987, he pleaded guilty to a kidnapping charge as part of a deal that resulted in related charges being dropped, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison as a result, while also being required to register permanently as a sex offender going forward. He ultimately served around 14 years of that sentence before being released in August 2001. While incarcerated as a young man, Kohlhepp made an unusual choice for someone in his situation. Rather than simply serving out his time, he pursued higher education from behind bars, eventually earning a bachelor's degree in computer science through a community college program available to inmates. After his release in 2001, he moved to South Carolina to be closer to his mother, who was already living in the state. He continued pursuing education once he was out, enrolling at a local technical college before transferring to the University of South Carolina Upstate, where he graduated in 2008 with a degree in business administration focused on marketing. For several years, he worked as a graphic designer for a local company in Spartanburg, South Carolina, before eventually shifting his career path entirely and becoming a licensed real estate agent. By most outward appearances, Kohlhepp had managed to fully rebuild his life after his release from prison. He ran a successful real estate business, purchased a large rural property spanning roughly 95 acres outside the town of Woodruff, South Carolina, and was generally seen by co-workers and acquaintances as a hard-working, if somewhat odd, business owner. None of the people around him during this period had any idea that Kohlhepp had already returned to committing serious violent crimes, beginning years before anyone would have any reason to suspect him of anything at all. In November 2003, 4 people connected to a motorcycle shop in Spartanburg County lost their lives in a single incident. The victims included the shop's manager Scott Ponder, along with bookkeeper Beverly Guy, service manager Brian Lucas, and mechanic Chris Sherbert. For more than a decade, this case remained completely unsolved, with investigators having no strong leads connecting any specific suspect to what had happened at the shop that day. Kohlhepp would later admit that his motive for targeting the shop stemmed from anger he had developed toward the manager during an earlier, seemingly minor dispute, an explanation that did little to make sense of the scale of what followed, but matched the pattern investigators eventually uncovered once his full confession came out years later. For more than a decade after the motorcycle shop case, Kohlhepp's life continued largely undisturbed. He built his real estate career, purchased additional property, and by all outward appearances remained a stable, if eccentric, member of his local community. In 2015, he hired a couple, Johnny Coxey and Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, to perform work on his rural property. According to his later confession, Kohlhepp ended Johnny's life almost immediately after some kind of dispute arose between them. Megan was kept alive on the property for several additional days afterward, before ultimately losing her life as well, with Kohlhepp later telling investigators he had made that decision around the Christmas holiday that year. Both of their bodies were buried somewhere on his expansive rural property, hidden well enough that no one outside Kohlhepp himself had any idea what had happened to the couple, who were simply reported missing by concerned family members in the months that followed. The case that finally unraveled everything began in August 2016, when a woman named Kala Brown went missing along with her boyfriend Charles Carver. The couple had been hired to do cleaning work on Kohlhepp's rural property, similar to the arrangement he had previously made with the Coxeys the year before. According to Brown's later account to investigators, Kohlhepp shot and killed Carver not long after they arrived, and from that point forward, Brown herself was held captive on the property for an extended period, kept restrained inside a storage container located somewhere on the land. In November 2016, investigators acting on an unrelated tip connected to a separate matter visited Kohlhepp's property and discovered Kala Brown chained inside that storage container, alive but having endured an extremely traumatic ordeal lasting roughly 2 months. Her rescue immediately triggered a much larger investigation into Kohlhepp himself, since her account directly implicated him in Carver's death and raised serious questions about what else might have happened on a property that large over the years he had owned it. Once in custody, Kohlhepp began cooperating with investigators in a way that went far beyond simply addressing Carver's death. He told his own mother during an early conversation following his arrest that there were far more victims connected to him than anyone yet realized, reportedly telling her cryptically that the number was more than she had fingers to count on. Over the following weeks, Kohlhepp led investigators to additional locations on his property, ultimately confessing not just to Carver's death but also to the deaths of the Coxey couple from the year before, along with his role in the long unsolved 2003 motorcycle shop case that had baffled investigators for over a decade. Faced with overwhelming evidence and a detailed, voluntary confession covering 7 separate deaths, prosecutors in South Carolina's 7th Judicial Circuit made the decision to pursue a plea agreement rather than risk a lengthy trial process. Although officials publicly stated that this case absolutely met the legal standard typically required to pursue the death penalty, practical concerns played a significant role in the final decision. South Carolina's supply of lethal injection drugs had expired years earlier, leaving prosecutors with serious uncertainty about how, or even whether, the state could actually carry out an execution in a reasonable time frame, even if a death sentence were secured. Rather than subject the surviving victims and the families of those who had died to years of additional legal proceedings and appeals with an uncertain outcome at the end, prosecutors agreed to a deal that would secure immediate, guaranteed consequences instead. On May 26, 2017, Kohlhepp formally pleaded guilty to all 7 killings connected to his case, along with related charges tied to the kidnapping and assault of Kala Brown during her time held captive on his property. As part of the agreement, he was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 60 years tacked on for the separate charges connected to Brown's ordeal. The agreement also required Kohlhepp to formally waive his right to appeal the sentence going forward, locking in the outcome permanently. During the sentencing hearing itself, family members of several victims were given the opportunity to address Kohlhepp directly in court, just feet away from where he sat in custody. One young relative, only a teenager at the time, spoke about growing up without his father because of what Kohlhepp had done. Another family member described how she had been forced to explain to her own young grandson that his father was never coming home. Throughout the hearing, witnesses and prosecutors alike noted that Kohlhepp showed little visible emotion as each family member spoke, sitting largely still and expressionless while the full human cost of his crimes was laid out in front of him. In the years following his sentencing, additional disturbing details have continued to surface connected to Kohlhepp's case. In 2018, investigators revealed that Kohlhepp had told them he believed there were at least 2 more victims buried somewhere near a highway in Spartanburg County, separate from the 7 deaths he had already confessed to and been sentenced for. Authorities conducted searches based on that information, though as of now, no additional remains tied to those specific claims have been definitively confirmed, leaving an unsettling open question about just how complete the full account of his crimes actually is. Kohlhepp has continued to draw attention from behind bars in ways that have frustrated both investigators and the families of his victims. In 2020, some of his personal belongings were auctioned off, with proceeds directed toward victims' families as part of an effort to provide some small measure of financial relief connected to the case. More recently, in October 2025, a local television investigation uncovered that Kohlhepp had been using a prison-issued tablet to attempt to profit directly from his crimes, reportedly working to sell autographed memorabilia connected to his case to interested buyers outside the prison system. That discovery prompted both an internal review by South Carolina's Department of Corrections and a separate criminal investigation by the State Attorney General's office. As a direct result, Kohlhepp was moved into supermax confinement on an indefinite basis, a much more restrictive form of custody that strips away nearly all outside contact. Under these new conditions, he has no visitor access, no phone privileges, and no tablet access at all, is monitored by cameras around the clock, and is permitted to leave his cell for only 1 hour each day. Family members of Kohlhepp's victims who attended meetings with investigators following that discovery expressed deep frustration that he had apparently been allowed any meaningful freedom or comfort behind bars at all in the years following his conviction. Parents of one victim specifically noted that they had assumed his imprisonment would mean a return to peace and quiet for their family, only to learn years later that he had instead spent a significant portion of his incarceration attempting to find new ways to draw attention to himself and his crimes. What makes Kohlhepp's case particularly disturbing to look back on is the timeline involved. He was not a stranger who suddenly appeared and vanished. He was a known sex offender who served time as a teenager, was released, and was given the opportunity to fully rebuild his life as a working professional in his community. He used that rebuilt life, including the size and privacy of his own rural property, to conceal multiple separate violent acts spanning more than a decade, all while running a legitimate business and interacting regularly with clients, co-workers, and neighbors who had absolutely no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Kohlhepp remains incarcerated under supermax restrictions in South Carolina today, serving out 7 consecutive life sentences that guarantee he will never again be free. His case stands as one of the clearest modern examples of how a violent offender can be released, rebuild a respectable public life, and still return to causing serious harm for years before anyone outside his own property has any idea what is actually happening. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kohlhepp's crimes went unnoticed for more than a decade simply because his property was large enough and private enough to hide almost anything. The next case on this list moves into a completely different kind of setting entirely, where the danger came not from an isolated rural property, but from inside a hospital room, delivered by someone whose job was supposed to be keeping patients safe. Charles Cullen, the killer nurse. Charles Edmund Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children in a working-class Catholic family. His childhood was shaped early on by loss. His father, who worked as a bus driver, passed away when Charles was only 7 months old, leaving his mother to raise 8 children largely on her own. Cullen later described those early years as miserable, claiming he was frequently bullied both by classmates and by some of his older sister's boyfriends. As a young boy, he reportedly struggled with deep emotional distress, and at the age of 9, he attempted to harm himself for the first time, an early and disturbing sign of mental health struggles that would follow him for the rest of his life. In December 1977, when Cullen was still a teenager, his mother died in a car accident, an event that led him to drop out of high school shortly afterward. Despite this difficult start, Cullen managed to find some structure in his life by enlisting in the United States Navy in 1978, where he served as a petty officer aboard a submarine. Even during his time in the military, he continued to struggle privately with depression, and he was eventually given a medical discharge in 1984. After leaving the Navy, Cullen decided to pursue a career in healthcare, enrolling at a nursing school in Montclair, New Jersey. He graduated in 1987 and quickly found work as a registered nurse, beginning what would become a 16-year career spanning at least 9 different hospitals and 1 nursing home across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. That same year, he married a woman named Adrienne, and the couple went on to have 2 daughters together. Cullen belongs on this list because he is alive today, in his 60s, and remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, a maximum security facility that holds some of the state's most dangerous offenders. What makes his case fundamentally different from almost every other name covered so far is the setting where his crimes took place. He did not stalk strangers or hide bodies in remote locations. He carried out his crimes inside hospital rooms, using his own medical training and a position of trust to harm the very people who had come to him, and to the healthcare system more broadly, for help. Cullen's first confirmed murder took place on June 11, 1988, while he was working at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. He later admitted to administering a lethal overdose of medication to a patient there, and over the following years at that same hospital, he confessed to harming several more patients, including one man being treated for a serious illness who died after Cullen gave him an overdose of insulin, a medication that should never have been part of that patient's treatment in the first place. In January 1992, hospital administrators at St. Barnabas began investigating a separate, troubling pattern involving contaminated intravenous bags discovered throughout the facility. Cullen left his position there shortly afterward, and a later review of those contaminated bags concluded that he had most likely been responsible, tying him to a number of additional deaths at that hospital that were never formally prosecuted. After leaving St. Barnabas, Cullen took a position at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, working in the coronary care unit. In August 1993, a 91-year-old patient being treated for cancer told her son that Cullen, who was not even her assigned nurse, had come into her hospital room and given her an injection. She died the following day. The hospital, growing concerned, administered lie detector tests to Cullen and several other staff members, and all of them passed. Cullen would later admit, as part of his eventual confession years afterward, that he had in fact given that patient a fatal dose of a heart medication called digoxin, a drug he would go on to misuse repeatedly throughout the rest of his career. Cullen's personal life during this same period was falling apart. He struggled with heavy drinking, and his behavior at home had become disturbing enough that his wife filed for divorce in January 1993. Followed several months later by a request for a protective order, citing fear that he might pose a danger to her and their 2 young daughters. The protective order was granted after Cullen had already been treated at more than one psychiatric facility for his ongoing mental health struggles. Around this same time, he was also arrested and pleaded guilty to a trespassing charge after breaking into the home of a former girlfriend, receiving a year of probation as a result, though this incident drew little attention at the time and did nothing to slow his ability to continue working in healthcare. Cullen left Warren Hospital at the end of 1993 and moved on to a 3-year position in the intensive care unit at Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, New Jersey, where he was, strangely enough, recognized with an employee award at some point during his time there. He later confessed to harming 5 patients there during a roughly 9-month stretch in 1996, again using overdoses of digoxin. After Hunterdon, Cullen briefly worked at Morristown Memorial Hospital but was let go fairly quickly due to poor job performance, leaving him unemployed for roughly 6 months. During this stretch, he sought treatment for depression at a hospital emergency room and was briefly admitted to a psychiatric facility, one of several documented mental health crises that punctuated his career without ever being connected by hospital administrators to his ongoing pattern of patient deaths. In February 1998, Cullen crossed into Pennsylvania for the first time professionally, taking a position at Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, where he was assigned to a unit caring for patients who depended on respirators. Over the following years, he moved between several additional Pennsylvania facilities, including Lehigh Valley Hospital, Sacred Heart Hospital, Easton Hospital, and St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem, rarely staying anywhere for very long, before either resigning under murky circumstances or being let go for unrelated performance issues. By the time investigators later pieced together his full history, they determined that Cullen had harmed at least 7 patients across these various Pennsylvania facilities. At St. Luke's specifically, hospital officials and a state pathologist were eventually brought in to review a troubling pattern across 69 separate patient deaths. But investigators at the time were unable to confirm a clear connection to any specific person, and Cullen was simply allowed to resign rather than face any formal action. What allowed Cullen to move so freely from hospital to hospital despite this growing trail of concern was largely a structural failure within the healthcare system itself. At the time, strict confidentiality rules and a fear of defamation lawsuits meant that hospitals had almost no reliable way to learn about a previous employer's concerns regarding a nurse who had never been formally charged with a crime or disciplined through an official state licensing process. Cullen had never been convicted of anything serious enough to show up on a standard background check, which meant that on paper, his employment record looked clean every single time he applied for a new position, even as informal whispers of suspicion followed him from hospital to hospital. In the fall of 2002, Cullen took a position in the critical care unit at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. This would turn out to be the final stop of his medical career, and the place where the majority of his eventually confirmed murders took place. While there, he developed a friendship with another nurse named Amy Loughran, who would later play an unexpected and crucial role in finally bringing his crimes to an end. By the summer of 2003, hospital staff at Somerset had grown increasingly alarmed by a cluster of unexplained patient deaths tied to unexplained medication levels. In July of that year, an assistant pharmacist contacted New Jersey's state poison control system after noticing a troubling pattern of deaths connected to overdoses of digoxin and insulin occurring within the same hospital ward. Acting on poison control's recommendation, Somerset officials finally reached out to New Jersey State Police in October 2003, more than 2 months after concerns had first been raised internally. One of the deaths that drew particular attention involved a local clergyman named Reverend Florian Gall, who had been recovering well from an unrelated illness before unexpectedly suffering a fatal cardiac event. A toxicology review later confirmed that Gall had an unauthorized and lethal level of digoxin in his system at the time of his death, despite having no medical reason to be receiving that medication at all. As investigators began quietly building their case, they turned to hospital staff for help, understanding the suspicious pattern of medication orders connected to the deaths. Amy Loughran, who had grown close to Cullen as a coworker and friend, was approached by detectives and asked to review automated medication dispensing records from the hospital's pharmacy system. What she found deeply disturbed her. Cullen had been repeatedly ordering large quantities of medications that had no clear connection to the patients actually assigned to his own care, and he had also been observed accessing the medical charts of patients who were not under his direct supervision, behavior that made little sense for someone simply doing his assigned job. Despite her personal connection to Cullen, Loughran made the difficult decision to cooperate fully with investigators, eventually agreeing to wear a hidden recording device during a conversation with him in order to help build a stronger case. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was arrested at a restaurant in New Jersey. He was initially charged with 1 count of murder connected to Reverend Gall's death, and 1 count of attempted murder connected to another patient who had survived a separate overdose. Just 2 days later, on December 14th, Cullen admitted to detectives that he had in fact caused Gall's death and had attempted to harm the surviving patient as well. He went much further than that during his initial interviews, telling investigators that, over the full span of his 16-year nursing career, he believed he may have harmed as many as 40 patients in total, a number that, even by his own admission, vastly exceeded what investigators had originally suspected when they first opened their case. In the months following his arrest, Cullen worked out a formal plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty entirely, he agreed to fully cooperate with investigators in identifying as many of his victims as possible, even in cases where physical evidence alone might never have been enough to support a conviction on its own. In April 2004, Cullen pleaded guilty in a New Jersey courtroom to killing patients at Somerset Medical Center and to attempting to harm 2 additional patients there through deliberate medication overdoses. The following month, he pleaded guilty to additional murders connected to his earlier years working at other New Jersey facilities. In November 2004, he appeared in a Pennsylvania courtroom and pleaded guilty to additional charges connected to his time working at hospitals across that state as well. Throughout his interviews with investigators, Cullen offered a disturbing and inconsistent explanation for his actions. He claimed that he had overdosed many of his patients, specifically to spare them from a slow, painful decline, telling detectives that he could not bear to witness or even hear about desperate, often unsuccessful attempts to revive a dying patient during a medical emergency. He framed his actions as a form of mercy, suggesting he wanted to prevent suffering and to keep hospital staff from what he described as dehumanizing treatment of patients during their final moments. This explanation, however, did not hold up against the actual facts of many of his cases. Several of his victims, including Reverend Gall himself, had been recovering and showing clear signs of improvement at the time Cullen chose to harm them, directly contradicting any claim that he was simply easing the suffering of patients who were already beyond hope. Cullen's formal sentencing took place across 2 separate states. On March 2, 2006, in a New Jersey courtroom presided over by Judge Paul W. Armstrong, Cullen received 11 consecutive life sentences connected to 22 confirmed murders across multiple New Jersey hospitals, a combined sentence totaling roughly 397 years, with no possibility of parole until sometime in the next century. During that hearing, when given the opportunity to speak, Cullen reportedly said nothing at all, sitting largely still with his eyes closed for much of the proceeding while family members of several victims addressed him directly. One family member, the daughter of an 89-year-old victim, told the court that she believed Cullen may genuinely have convinced himself he was acting as an angel of mercy, even as she made clear she did not accept that explanation as any kind of justification. A separate sentencing hearing took place shortly afterward in Pennsylvania, where Cullen faced consequences connected to the murders he had confessed to committing at facilities across that state. That hearing took an unusual turn when Cullen, apparently dissatisfied with how the judge was handling the proceeding, repeatedly interrupted the courtroom by demanding that the judge step down, continuing to do so even after being warned multiple times to stop. Eventually, the judge ordered Cullen to be physically restrained from speaking further for the remainder of the hearing in order to allow the proceeding to continue. He ultimately received additional consecutive life sentences in Pennsylvania connected to the murders he had confessed to in that state. In total, across both states, Cullen confessed to and was formally convicted of 29 murders, though he has personally suggested the real number could be closer to 40. And some investigators and researchers who have studied his case in depth have suggested the true total could be substantially higher, with some estimates reaching as high as several hundred patients across his full 16-year career. The reason so many additional deaths could never be formally confirmed comes down to the simple passage of time and the destruction or loss of hospital records, particularly from his earliest years working at facilities that had no reason at the time to preserve detailed records connected to deaths that were never flagged as suspicious in the first place. Cullen's case had ripple effects well beyond his own criminal sentencing. In 2008, families of several of his New Jersey victims reached a confidential financial settlement with multiple hospitals connected to his employment history, including claims that at least one previous employer had failed to properly warn Somerset Medical Center about earlier concerns before Cullen was ever hired there. In 2010, a separate group of 8 families in Pennsylvania filed a wrongful death lawsuit directly against Cullen personally, even though he had never been formally charged in connection with their specific loved ones' deaths, arguing that their family members were very likely among the many additional victims he was never charged for. Because Cullen did not mount any defense in that civil case, a jury in March 2010 awarded those families a combined $95 million in damages, though the practical likelihood of Cullen ever having any meaningful assets to actually pay that judgment remains essentially non-existent. Cullen's case has also drawn attention to a much larger systemic problem within American healthcare regulation. At the time of his arrest, New Jersey Senator John Corzine publicly described the broader failure that allowed Cullen to continue working for so long as a complete and utter failure of the healthcare system, pointing specifically to the lack of any centralized registry or reliable communication system that might have allowed hospitals to learn about previous concerns connected to a nurse before deciding to hire them. In the years since, Cullen's case has frequently been cited in broader discussions about reforming how healthcare facilities share information about employees suspected of serious misconduct, even when formal charges were never filed at the time. Cullen's mental health struggles, which had been present since his childhood, continued well into his adult life and his criminal career. He was hospitalized on multiple occasions for depression in the years leading up to his arrest, and investigators later learned that he had made several attempts to take his own life over the years, struggles that were known to at least some people around him but were never connected by anyone to the broader pattern of patient deaths quietly following him from hospital to hospital. Today, Charles Cullen remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, a maximum security facility that also houses several other notorious offenders connected to some of New Jersey's most serious criminal cases. Given the length and structure of his combined sentences across 2 states, there is no realistic scenario in which Cullen will ever be released, and he is expected to remain in custody until his natural death. What makes Cullen's case especially unsettling, even compared to many of the other names covered on this list, is the simple fact that his victims were already in a place specifically meant to protect and care for them. They were not strangers picked off a street or lured into an unfamiliar setting. They were hospital patients, often elderly or seriously ill, who had placed their trust directly in the hands of the healthcare system, and in Cullen specifically, never imagining that the person adjusting their medication could be the very source of the danger they were trying to recover from. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cullen hid behind the trust people place in their own doctors and nurses for 16 straight years, moving between hospitals whenever suspicion got too close for comfort. The next case on this list shows that this exact same danger has not disappeared with time, since a more recent nurse, working in a completely different state decades later, was found guilty of doing something disturbingly similar to patients in her own care. Heather Presti, the killer nurse of Western Pennsylvania. Heather Irene Presti was born on August 28, 1982, in Natrona Heights, a small community in western Pennsylvania, the older of 2 children born to Michael and Bonita Presti. Her early adult life followed a fairly ordinary path. Between 2003 and 2004, she attended the Community College of Allegheny County, though she did not complete a degree there at the time. Instead of pursuing nursing right away, Presti spent the next 14 years working as a registered veterinary technician at the Pittsburgh Veterinary Specialty and Emergency Center, where her responsibilities included caring for critically ill animals, helping administer anesthesia, and at times assisting with euthanasia procedures. It was not until 2016 that she returned to school to pursue an associate degree in nursing, finally earning her registered nursing license on July 31, 2018, at the age of 35. Presti belongs on this list for a reason that sets her apart from almost every other name covered so far. Unlike most of the cases discussed up to this point, which stretch back decades, her crimes are recent, unfolding entirely within the early 2020s, proving that this same disturbing pattern of harm carried out by a trusted medical professional has not disappeared with time or improved oversight. She is alive today, in her 40s, and is currently serving a sentence that guarantees she will spend the rest of her life behind bars in a Pennsylvania state prison. Once Presti earned her nursing license in 2018, her career took on a troubling and repetitive pattern almost immediately. Over the following years, she moved through a long string of different nursing homes and care facilities across western Pennsylvania, rarely staying anywhere for very long. According to court documents later compiled by investigators, Presti was formally disciplined at numerous separate facilities for abusive behavior directed at either patients or fellow staff members, and at nearly every one of those locations, she either resigned under pressure or was terminated outright before moving on to the next job. In her very first nursing position, she was disciplined specifically for administering insulin to a patient outside of what a physician had actually prescribed, an early warning sign that, in hindsight, foreshadowed exactly the kind of harm she would go on to cause repeatedly over the following years. Despite this consistent pattern of red flags, Presti continued finding new nursing jobs without much difficulty. Investigators later determined that she had been disciplined or let go from at least 11 separate facilities throughout her short nursing career, yet she was still able to secure a 12th position without any of those previous concerns following her, in a way that might have stopped her from being hired again. This pattern closely echoes a similar systemic failure seen in earlier cases of medical professionals who harmed patients, where strict employment privacy practices and a general reluctance among healthcare facilities to share negative information about former employees allowed a clearly dangerous individual to continue moving freely from job to job. Presti's pattern of harming patients appears to have begun around 2020, according to the timeline later established by investigators, though her formal nursing license was not suspended until early 2023, shortly after charges were first filed against her. During this multi-year stretch, she worked across at least 5 separate care facilities spread throughout Allegheny, Armstrong, Butler, and Westmoreland counties in western Pennsylvania, an area centered around the greater Pittsburgh region. At several of these facilities, co-workers who later spoke with investigators admitted that they had developed serious concerns about Presti's behavior and attitude toward the patients in her care well before any formal action was ever taken against her. At one facility in Westmoreland County specifically, co-workers reportedly began referring to her informally among themselves, using the nickname the killer nurse, a deeply unsettling detail that suggests at least some people around her sensed something was deeply wrong, even if nobody acted on that suspicion at the time. Presti's method of harming patients centered specifically on insulin, a medication that, when given to someone who does not actually need it, or given in dangerously excessive amounts to someone who does, can rapidly and severely lower a person's blood sugar to a life-threatening level. According to investigators, Presti targeted both diabetic and non-diabetic patients in this way, meaning that in many cases, the very patients she harmed had no legitimate medical reason to be receiving the medication in the first place. She was also reported to have specifically chosen to administer these excessive doses during overnight shifts, a period when staffing levels at most nursing facilities tend to be significantly lower, making it far less likely that a sudden medical emergency would be caught quickly enough to allow for immediate hospitalization and the kind of testing that might have exposed exactly what was happening. Investigators later described an especially calculated detail connected to Presti's pattern of harm. According to the criminal complaint built against her, she frequently took deliberate steps to make sure that her victims would pass away before her own shift ended, specifically to avoid a scenario where a patient might instead be rushed to a hospital while still alive, since hospital testing, including a specific blood test known as a C-peptide test, could have clearly revealed that a dangerous and unauthorized dose of insulin was the true cause behind a sudden medical crisis. This level of calculation suggested to investigators that Presti was not simply acting impulsively in the moment, but was instead operating with a clear, repeated strategy aimed specifically at avoiding detection for as long as possible. When investigators eventually reviewed private text messages exchanged between Presti and her mother, covering a period stretching from April 2022 through May 2023, they discovered a disturbing pattern of complaints. In these messages, Presti repeatedly expressed deep frustration and irritation toward specific patients and coworkers, at times explicitly discussing the idea of causing them harm. Former coworkers who later spoke to investigators recalled Presti making similar comments out loud during her shifts, with one specifically remembering her saying on more than one occasion that certain patients needed to die. When confronted by investigators after her arrest, Presti repeated several disturbing justifications for her own actions, telling them at different points that one particular patient had no real quality of life remaining, and that another patient had looked at her in a way she compared to how an animal might look at someone. Comments that, given her many years of prior experience working with euthanasia procedures on sick animals, suggest a deeply troubling overlap between her two very different careers. The investigation that finally exposed Presti's pattern of harm began in the late summer of 2022, while she was working at Quality Life Services, a skilled nursing facility located in Chicora, Pennsylvania, where she had been employed since May of that year and had been promoted into a role as interim director of nursing, a position that, in a deeply troubling irony, placed her in charge of investigating exactly the kind of patient care concerns she herself was secretly causing. On August 31, 2022, a staff member at the facility discovered a 73-year-old male patient experiencing a severe medical emergency in his bed. Around the same general period, hospital staff at a nearby medical center who treated some of these emergency transfers grew increasingly alarmed by an unusual pattern of patients arriving with dangerously low blood sugar levels that did not match their documented medical histories. One experienced nurse practitioner later told investigators that she had never witnessed anything quite like this pattern across her entire 3-decade nursing career. As suspicion mounted, co-workers at Quality Life Services began pointing investigators specifically toward Presti, even though, by the time a full formal investigation was actually underway, she had already left that particular facility for other work. Investigators eventually built a detailed criminal complaint covering more than 40 pages, describing how Presti had confessed, piece by piece, to harming a long list of individual patients once she was formally brought in for questioning. On May 24, 2023, Presti told investigators directly that she had caused the deaths of 2 patients and had attempted to harm a third, framing her actions, much like earlier cases of medical professionals who harmed patients in their care, as a form of mercy rather than malice. The very next day, May 25th, she was formally charged with 2 counts of homicide, 1 count of attempted murder, 1 count of aggravated assault, and several additional related charges. Following her arrest, she was held without bail at Butler County Prison, while the broader investigation into her nursing career continued to expand. As word of her arrest spread, additional families who had lost loved ones at facilities where Presti had previously worked began coming forward with their own concerns, prompting investigators to widen their inquiry significantly. By November 2023, a second, much larger set of charges had been filed, ultimately connecting Presti to a combined total of 22 separate patients across 5 different facilities, with investigators confirming that at least 17 of those individual cases had ended in the patient's death. The patients connected to her case ranged dramatically in age, from as young as 43 years old to as old as 104. Demonstrating that her pattern of harm was not limited to only the most elderly or already failing patients in her care. In February 2024, during what was originally scheduled as a routine status hearing, Presti grew visibly frustrated with her own defense attorneys in open court, loudly questioning why the process was taking so long, given that she had already confessed nearly 10 months earlier. Her attorneys explained to the court that they still needed additional time to fully review the enormous volume of medical records connected to the dozens of individual cases involved, given the sheer scale and complexity of what prosecutors had compiled against her. On May 2, 2024, Presti formally appeared before Butler County Common Pleas Judge Joseph Kubit and entered her guilty plea, doing so specifically in order to avoid the possibility of facing the death penalty at trial. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 19 separate counts of criminal attempt to commit murder. During the plea hearing itself, Presti spoke only briefly, responding to most of the court's procedural questions with short, single-word answers. When one of her own attorneys directly asked her, in front of the court, why she was choosing to plead guilty, Presti responded simply by stating that it was because she was in fact guilty. As part of her plea agreement, Judge Kubit sentenced Presti to 3 consecutive life terms connected to the murder charges, along with an additional consecutive sentence ranging from 380 to 760 years tied to the 19 separate attempted murder counts. Pennsylvania's Attorney General at the time, Michelle Henry, stated publicly following the sentencing that Presti had used her position of trust as a means to poison patients who depended entirely on her for their care, adding that while the sentence could never bring back the lives that had been lost, it would ensure that Presti would never again have the opportunity to cause harm to anyone else. The sentencing hearing itself stretched across multiple days specifically to allow a long list of family members connected to her victims the opportunity to address her directly in court. Several family members used that opportunity to confront Presti head-on. The daughter of one victim, a 78-year-old woman named Irene Simons, who was not even diabetic at the time, Presti administered her a fatal dose of insulin, told the court that she would never forgive what had been done, expressing anger and hurt that Presti had disguised herself as a caring nurse while taking someone from this world that she had absolutely no right to take. Another family member spoke on behalf of a relative who had survived being shot down during military service in Vietnam decades earlier and had received a Purple Heart for his service, only to lose his life years later at the hands of the very nurse meant to be caring for him, telling the court that the only justice he truly wanted was to make sure something like this could never happen to anyone else again. A sister of another victim described Presti in starkly simple terms as pure evil, adding that real justice would only come once Presti eventually faced a higher reckoning beyond anything the courtroom could deliver. Throughout these emotional statements, witnesses in the courtroom noted that Presti largely avoided making eye contact with the people speaking, showing little visible reaction even when one statement included a sharply worded insult directed at her that caused much of the courtroom gallery to break into spontaneous applause. In the aftermath of Presti's guilty plea and sentencing, several families connected to her victims pursued separate civil lawsuits against the nursing facilities that had employed her, arguing that administrators at these locations either knew or reasonably should have known about her troubling employment history well before hiring her, given how consistently she had been disciplined or dismissed from previous positions for almost identical reasons. One such lawsuit, filed on behalf of a victim named Marianne Bauer who died at a nursing home in Westmoreland County, specifically alleged that facility administrators were already aware of Presti's pattern of prior workplace discipline and still failed to take any meaningful action to protect their own patients before bringing her onto their staff. Presti's case has since become a significant point of discussion among healthcare regulators and lawmakers in Pennsylvania, drawing direct comparisons to the much earlier case of Charles Cullen, the nurse whose own string of hospital killings decades earlier exposed similar gaps in how healthcare facilities share information about employees with documented histories of misconduct. Her case has specifically prompted renewed conversations around the idea of creating a more centralized employee registry system, one that could track serious disciplinary patterns across multiple healthcare employers in a way that might prevent someone with a documented history like Presti's from simply moving on to a new facility every time their previous employer quietly let them go without taking any further formal action. Presti remains incarcerated today within the Pennsylvania state prison system, where she is expected to spend the remainder of her natural life. Given the structure and length of her combined sentence, covering 3 separate life terms, stacked directly on top of several additional centuries of incarceration tied to her remaining charges, there is no realistic scenario under which she will ever again be free to work in any capacity, let alone return to a position of care over vulnerable patients. What makes Presti's case especially difficult to process, even compared to earlier examples covered elsewhere on this list, is just how recent it truly is. While many of the most well-known names connected to this kind of crime committed their offenses decades ago, before modern background check systems and more advanced medical record tracking technology existed, Presti's pattern of harm took place almost entirely within the last several years, proving conclusively that even with significant advances in how healthcare facilities are supposed to monitor and share concerns about dangerous employees, a person determined enough to exploit the remaining gaps in that system can still cause devastating harm to the very people who trusted them most. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Presti's crimes prove that this exact danger never fully disappeared, even decades after Charles Cullen first exposed how badly the system could fail. The next case on this list moves completely away from hospital wards and nursing homes entirely, landing on a quiet New York suburb where a married father of 3 managed to hide an active killing pattern for over a decade before investigators finally connected him to a beach where several bodies had been discovered years earlier. Rex Heuermann, the Gilgo Beach Killer. Rex Andrew Heuermann was born on September 13, 1963, in Massapequa Park, New York, a quiet village on the south shore of Long Island. His father, Theodore, was a World War II veteran who had served as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force, and his mother, Dolores, was remembered by people who knew the family as a controlling figure who Heuermann remained extremely close to throughout his life. His father passed away in 1975 when Heuermann was just 12 years old. Childhood acquaintances who later spoke to reporters described Heuermann as something of a mama's boy growing up, someone who stayed unusually attached to his mother well into adulthood. He graduated from Berner High School in Massapequa Park in 1981, the same graduating class as actor William Baldwin. In 1994, Heuermann purchased his own childhood home directly from his mother, and he continued living there for nearly 3 decades, right up until the moment of his eventual arrest in 2023. Neighbors over the years noticed that the house grew increasingly run down compared to the more upscale homes surrounding it, a small but telling detail that hinted at a life slowly falling apart behind closed doors, even as Heuermann maintained an outwardly respectable career. By trade, Heuermann worked as an architectural consultant in Manhattan, building a reasonably successful professional career over the years. He married a woman named Asa Ellerup, and the couple had a daughter together, with Ellerup also raising a son from a previous relationship as part of their blended family. For much of his adult life, Heuermann appeared to be exactly what his neighbors and co-workers assumed him to be: a steady, unremarkable family man commuting into the city for work and coming home each night to the same modest house he had grown up in. What none of them knew was that, for roughly 2 decades, Heuermann was also responsible for one of the most disturbing and longest-running unsolved cases in modern American criminal history. Heuermann belongs on this list for a reason that makes his case unlike any other covered so far. He is the most recently confirmed name in this entire list, having only pleaded guilty and been formally sentenced within the last several months. His case represents the clearest possible example of how a violent pattern can remain completely hidden behind an ordinary suburban life for years, even decades, before modern forensic technology finally catches up. The case that would eventually lead investigators to Heuermann's door first came to public attention in May 2010, when a young woman named Shannon Gilbert went missing on Long Island under troubling circumstances. The search for Gilbert led police into a remote, marshy stretch of land along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, an area that would soon reveal far more than anyone searching for her had expected to find. In December 2010, investigators discovered the remains of 4 separate women in close proximity to one another. These 4 victims, Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainard Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, became known collectively as the Gilgo Four, and all 4 had gone missing between 2007 and 2010, sharing in common the fact that they were all young women who had been working in the sex trade and advertising their services online at the time they disappeared. Their remains had each been bound and wrapped in a similar manner before being left in the same general area, a pattern that immediately suggested to investigators that a single person was likely responsible for all 4 deaths. Over the following months, in March and April of 2011, the search for additional remains in the area expanded dramatically. Several more sets of human remains turned up scattered across the same general stretch of coastline, eventually bringing the total number of bodies connected to the broader search up to 11 separate individuals. Some of these additional remains were later connected through forensic work to earlier completely separate cold cases that had gone unsolved for years, suggesting that whoever was responsible for the deaths along Gilgo Beach had likely been active for far longer than investigators had originally assumed back in 2010. Despite the scale of this discovery and the intense media attention it generated at the time, the case went cold for more than a decade, with no clear suspect ever identified despite years of ongoing investigation. The case finally began moving forward again in February 2022, when Suffolk County's newly appointed police commissioner, Rodney Harrison, announced the formation of a fresh task force specifically dedicated to re-examining the Gilgo Beach killings, bringing together investigators from state, county, and federal agencies who had not previously worked the case together in this combined capacity. This renewed task force began revisiting old evidence with newer forensic techniques that simply had not existed back when the bodies were first discovered, including significant advances in DNA analysis and a relatively new field known as forensic genetic genealogy, which allows investigators to build family tree connections from genetic material left behind at a crime scene, even when no direct match exists in a traditional criminal database. Investigators eventually connected a strand of male hair recovered from one of the original Gilgo 4 victims to broader phone and travel pattern evidence that pointed toward a man living in Massapequa Park, a community located roughly 15 miles from where the bodies had been found. To confirm this potential connection without alerting their suspect, investigators waited for an opportunity to collect a usable DNA sample discreetly. That opportunity came in the form of a discarded pizza crust that Heuermann had thrown away in a public trash can in Midtown Manhattan. On June 12, 2023, testing confirmed that DNA recovered from that discarded crust matched the male hair found years earlier on one of the original victims. Combined with that DNA match, along with separate evidence connecting Heuermann's personal cell phone activity to a series of disposable burner phones believed to have been used to contact several of the victims around the time of their disappearances, investigators finally had enough to move forward. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested in Midtown Manhattan and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder, connected specifically to the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. At the same time, prosecutors publicly named him as the prime suspect in the 4th Gilgo 4 case, the death of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, even though formal charges connected to her case would not follow until several months later. Following his arrest, Heuermann's defense attorney told reporters that his client had been in tears overnight, repeatedly insisting that he had not done this. As the investigation expanded in the months that followed, additional forensic connections continued to surface. In August 2023, investigators announced that they had finally identified a previously unidentified victim known for years only as Fire Island Jane Doe, confirming through DNA testing that her remains belonged to a 34-year-old woman named Karen Vergata, who had gone missing back in 1996. In January 2024, Heuermann was formally charged in connection with Maureen Brainerd Barnes's death as well, after investigators determined that a hair recovered alongside her remains was genetically similar to a DNA sample connected to Heuermann's own wife, a detail that added an unsettling new layer to the case, given that Heuermann's family had apparently been living alongside physical evidence connected to his crimes without ever knowing it. In May 2024, investigators returned to Heuermann's longtime family home for an extensive search that stretched on for nearly a full week. The following month, in June 2024, he was formally charged with 2 additional murders, those of Sandra Costilla and Jessica Taylor. Costilla's case was particularly significant because her remains had actually been discovered all the way back in November 1993 in a wooded area roughly 60 miles from Gilgo Beach, meaning her death had never previously been connected to the broader pattern at all. This connection pushed the known timeline of Heuermann's crimes back significantly further than investigators had originally believed, suggesting his pattern of violence had actually begun in the early 1990s rather than the mid-2000s. In December 2024, A further indictment connected Huerman to the death of Valerie Mack, whose partial remains had first been discovered in 2000, with additional remains connected to her case turning up at Gilgo Beach itself back in 2011, though her full identity was not confirmed until 2020 through genetic genealogy work completed before Huerman himself had ever even become a named suspect. During the broader legal proceedings connected to his case, prosecutors revealed an especially disturbing piece of evidence recovered from Huerman's personal devices. According to court filings, investigators discovered what they described as a detailed planning document on one of his devices, outlining specific strategies related to carrying out future killings, properly disposing of remains, avoiding capture, and steering clear of leaving behind DNA evidence, along with notes about what kind of supplies someone might need to carry out this type of crime repeatedly over time. This discovery suggested to investigators that Huerman's pattern of violence was not simply a series of isolated impulsive acts, but something he had continued to actively plan and refine even as decades passed. For roughly 1,000 days following his initial arrest, Huerman maintained his innocence, continuing to plead not guilty across each new set of charges brought against him. That changed on April 8, 2026, when Huerman appeared in a Suffolk County courtroom packed with reporters, victims' family members, and uniformed law enforcement officials, and calmly reversed his position entirely. He pleaded guilty to all 7 murder charges he was formally facing, covering the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, Sandra Costilla, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, and Megan Waterman. In a moment that stunned the courtroom, Huerman went even further than his formal charges required, openly admitting during the same hearing that he was also responsible for the earlier death of Karen Vergata, a case he had never actually been charged with, bringing his total confirmed victim count to 8 separate women. Huerman's formal sentencing took place on June 17, 2026, at a hearing held in Riverhead, New York, that stretched on as a long line of family members connected to his victims were given the opportunity to address him directly in court. One mother spoke about the impact of losing her daughter decades earlier, telling Huerman plainly that what he had done to her family was beyond anything words could fully express. A sister of one of his victims described the devastating phone call she received after her siblings' remains were finally identified, recalling specific painful details about the condition in which parts of her sister's body were eventually found, and expressing disbelief that, even decades later, not all of her remains were ever fully recovered. Another family member spoke about losing not just her sister, but her own sense of safety and peace of mind in the years that followed, describing herself as having become, in her own words, another one of Huerman's victims, simply by having to live every day with what he had taken from her family. Throughout these statements, witnesses in the courtroom noted that Huerman rarely reacted, sitting largely still and showing little visible emotion as each family member spoke directly to him. When the presiding judge, State Supreme Court Justice Timothy Mazzei, eventually asked Huerman directly whether there was anything he wished to say to the families gathered in court, Huerman responded quietly that there were no words he could offer, adding that anything he might say would carry no real meaning. When the judge pressed further, asking him directly whether he was sorry for what he had done, Huerman simply answered yes. Justice Mazzei responded by describing Huerman as a disgusting, despicable, and small man, as well as a coward, before formally handing down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, with each individual life sentence ordered to run consecutively rather than at the same time, ensuring there would be no realistic path to release under any circumstance. In the years surrounding the case, Huerman's personal life completely fell apart as well. Shortly after his initial arrest in 2023, his wife, Asa Ellerup, filed for divorce, which was formally finalized in 2025. Despite the divorce, Ellerup has spoken publicly in documentary interviews about still caring deeply for Huerman, describing complicated feelings that several family members of his victims found deeply difficult to hear, given everything that had since come to light about him. Family members connected to several of the victims have also publicly criticized various documentary projects that emerged covering the case, expressing frustration that certain filmmakers appeared to be profiting from the suffering connected to crimes that had caused such lasting devastation to their own families. Huerman is now incarcerated within the New York State prison system, where he will spend the remainder of his life following his consecutive life sentences. Investigators have made clear that, even with his guilty plea and sentencing now complete, the broader Gilgo Beach case may not be fully closed. Several additional sets of remains discovered during the original 2010 and 2011 search have never been formally connected to Huerman or to anyone else, and authorities have indicated that work identifying those remaining unidentified victims is expected to continue well beyond his sentencing. Huerman's case stands as a stark reminder that even in the modern era, with advanced forensic science and decades of accumulated investigative experience, a violent pattern hidden behind an ordinary suburban life can remain undetected for an extraordinarily long time, sometimes only coming to light because a single piece of forensic technology finally catches up to evidence that had been sitting untouched for years. Across all 10 of the cases covered in this list, the same unsettling thread connects every single one of them. Each of these men managed to hide in plain sight for years, sometimes for decades, behind jobs, families, churches, uniforms, and ordinary neighborhoods, proving again and again that the most dangerous people are rarely the ones who look the part. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.